Titanic from 1997 is a film that a lot of people on the internet just love to hate. Partially because it was probably so successful. It's just one of those strange cultural phenomena where the more popular it gets, the more people don't want to like it. But if you've watched this channel in the past, you'll know that I'm a big fan of it. And the reason for that is it's one of the films that got me really interested in Titanic in the first place. This is mainly because it was done really well. The film gets a lot right, especially when you consider that this is kind of like the era where Hollywood was pumping out some dubiously historically accurate films, which were still great, but kind of played with history a little bit. Titanic did its best, thanks largely to the hyper-focus and the energy of James Cameron, his drive to get things exactly right. Titanic did its best to do just that. But there's a couple of times where the movie falls down in really weird ways. There are certain parts of the film that I watch today and cringe a little bit. So instead of blindly praising the film, which is what I tend to do, I thought today instead we'd look at some of the little annoying details that Titanic got wrong. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm your friend Mike Brady from Oceanliner Designs, and these are some errors from the film Titanic. So some of the errors in the film Titanic we can't actually hold against James Cameron and co. We've since learnt a lot about the way Titanic sank and some of the things that happened. So some of the commonly cited mistakes in the film I'm not going to harp on about, and I think it's unfair to attack the film for it, because we just didn't know, or at least James Cameron and his crew didn't know what we know today. So one of those things has to do with the angle of the ship sinking and the angle of its breakup. So in the film we can see it getting to this crazy 45 degree angle, and then it breaks. And we now know that just couldn't have happened. The hull failed a lot sooner on. There was an analysis done in the 2000s, close to 10 years actually after the film was made, that showed that Titanic's hull reached peak stresses at around about the 23 through 30 degree angle mark. Now that's a pretty extreme angle. It, from the lifeboats and from people in the water, may as well have been 45 degrees, because when you have something that big roaring up out of the water, or as Louis Bodine in the film puts it,
finally she's got her whole ass is sticking up in the air.
Thank you, Louis. Rearing up out of the water, sure enough, it's going to look like it was 45 degrees, and that's probably how you'll retell it for the rest of your life. But in reality, it was probably a little less, and certainly no less impressive, and that's where Titanic broke her back. Now that's a knowledge gap thing that we can totally excuse them for. This other one is actually a deliberate mistake. This is a little bit different. In the film, Titanic sinks on a very even keel. You can see that right at the end as the ship is plunging into the ocean. There's not much movement from side to side. The ship is obviously going down by the head, but it's very stable. And Titanic did sink on a really stable, even keel. Fortunately, she flooded very evenly. The ship's engineers and crew spent time actually trimming the tanks and making sure that the ship would sink evenly instead of rolling over, which is what ships tend to do when they sink, as we learnt relatively recently with the Costa Concordia. But the night Titanic sank, the ship did sink on an even keel, but not that even. There was still a little bit of a list. The list is what you get if a ship is down on one side, left, port, or right, starboard. So Titanic, we know, alternated her list as different parts of the ship flooded through the night. Now, right at the end, the list did stabilize out and the ship did sink on a fairly even keel. But throughout the night, it alternated between 5, maybe 10 degrees from one side to the other. Now, Cameron and his team knew this, but they ignored it. And the simple reason for that was that in filming a Hollywood production, Cameron and co decided to use a almost life-size reproduction of the ship. Now, this set is one of the most epic ever produced for any Hollywood production, in my opinion, and I've covered it in some more detail on the channel. But simply put, dropping this set down by one side and then changing the list and then trying to make sure it was the same across different scenes and there weren't any major discrepancies would have been a huge, huge challenge. And for the production, it would have added heaps to the budget, and obviously they just decided to ignore it. And again, this is one of those things that when it comes down to historical authenticity, we can give them a pass because, hey, they built like a 90% scale replica and sank it. And it shows. Like, Titanic holds up really, really well, in my opinion. It looks fantastic. So, okay, yeah, it doesn't have the list from side to side, but we can excuse them for that. What I'm not going to excuse is this.
The ship's too big with too small a rudder. Doesn't corner worth a damn.
This is one of those pervasive myths that exists to this day, partly because of things like the film Titanic. So let's unpack this for a minute. How do we know Titanic did not have too small a rudder, wasn't a bad turning ship? First of all, Harland and Wolff, the shipbuilders, knew their stuff. Like, they'd been building ships a very long time, and they'd built hundreds of them. And they knew very well what a maneuverable ship should look like, and should include. Titanic's rudder was like 5-6 stories tall. It weighed around about 100 tons. It was a monster of a thing. It was extremely powerful. It had a set of steering engines, which were miniature steam engines at the top of it that could actually control the steerage, and it could get hard over from one side to the other in a fairly quick amount of time. It's not necessarily about the size of the rudder for a ship's maneuverability, but its relationship with the propellers having the wash of water over them. You don't need a massive rudder. You actually just need a slight diversion in the flow of water over the rudder to actually get the ship turning. So the two pieces of evidence we can put forward to know that Titanic did actually have a large enough rudder for a ship of its size is, first of all, on the night of the sinking, the ship's lookouts, Fleet and Lee, spotted the berg with about 500 yards or so to spare. And they rang down and they alerted the bridge. The bridge probably spotted the iceberg at around about the same time and actually already knew what was going on, and so had initiated the turn. They struck the berg around about 35 to 40 seconds later, and it wasn't a head-on collision. They'd spotted the berg, and the berg was essentially stem on to the ship like you see in the film, like perfectly in front of the ship. From the time it took for that 35 seconds to elapse, Murdoch on the bridge, the first officer, had either been alerted to the iceberg or spotted it himself, telegraphed down to have the ship's engines stopped, and slowly Titanic's bow began to turn away from the iceberg. But suffice it to say, they almost made it. We know that because the damage was so slight. We know the damage was actually not a big, deep gouge. It was really like a bumping, grinding motion that opened up some of the plate seams and then allowed water in. They almost got out of the way. So in 30 seconds thereabouts, Titanic's crew were able to spot the iceberg and turn their ship almost out of the way. Almost. We're talking centimeters, but they didn't quite get it. And unfortunately, yeah, they had that bumping motion around, down the side of the ship, and the berg opened up the plates. Now that is a very impressive response time, considering they almost got their ship out of the way. That 30-40 second amount of time, if you just count that off right now in your mind and say, gee, do you think you'd be able to get a ship that big, 45,000 tons doing top speed, 22 knots, out of the way of an iceberg like that? It had to have been quite maneuverable. Titanic's maneuverability had already been tested during her sea trials. She was put through a series of tests, and her turning was found to be quite satisfactory at the tests. They threw the wheel hard over, one direction, then another, and sure enough, the ship could turn just fine. And another piece of evidence that tells us that Titanic's rudder was fine is her sister ship Olympic. Olympic had a long and very successful career. In fact, Bertram Hayes, who was Olympic's wartime commander during the First World War, praised Olympic's maneuverability and said she was one of the most maneuverable ships he ever had the pleasure to command. So that speaks to the maneuverability of Titanic indirectly as well. So was this a film mistake? It could just be a character error. This is Brock Lovett, after all, explaining things the way he sees it. But annoyingly, to this day, people still think Titanic's rudder was too small. Titanic is also guilty of portraying actual historical people in unfair ways. And one person that springs to mind straight away is Bruce Ismay. Bruce Ismay was the president of the White Star Line, Titanic's parent company, the owner, and he was also heavily involved with the International Mercantile Marine, which was a large conglomerate that essentially controlled a number of shipping lines, including the White Star Line. And he is always portrayed as this moustache-twirling, Dick Dastardly style villain, and that is a very long story to unpick. And we've actually got a video coming out about him this week, I think, on the channel midweek, so you might want to check that one out. But in the film, something happens that's very important. You might miss it if you kind of blinked, but it's this conversation.
So you've not yet lit the last 4 boilers?
I would prefer not to push the engines until they've been properly run in.
Now, this is based on a real piece of testimony. First-class passenger Elizabeth Lynes was sitting in the reception room and overheard Bruce Ismay and Captain Smith having a conversation. Now, she related to the inquiry that Ismay was discussing Titanic's speed and the possibility of putting more pressure onto the boilers. Now, this has been interpreted as Ismay himself actually putting pressure on Captain Smith to speed the ship up to make it into New York ahead of schedule. They were meant to arrive Wednesday morning, and the theory goes that Bruce Ismay wanted to make record headlines and get in on the Tuesday night. But there's actually a lot of evidence that suggests Ismay really wasn't that keen on the idea at all. So first of all, in this film, Ismay is very clearly putting pressure on Captain Smith.
What a glorious end to your final crossing if we were to get into New York on Tuesday night and surprise them all. Good man.
But that's not what Lynes said she heard. She said this. Now, that's a very distinct difference. This can be read a number of different ways. To my mind, this sounds like Bruce Ismay is actually just making an observation. Hey, we're actually doing really well. The engines are working, the boilers are working fine, we can put more steam on. Gee, at this rate, we'll probably even beat Olympic into New York. That's it. Not go out with a bang, AEJ. Big difference. There's actually even more evidence to suggest that Ismay was averse to the idea of an early arrival. Famously, Ismay actually saved his own life by getting into a lifeboat. And to be fair, the film actually shows it in a realistic way. It was at a point of the sinking, according to Ismay and others around him, where there weren't many people around. There certainly weren't any women and children around. And so he stepped into the boat and got away from the ship. And as the film also shows, he didn't watch it sink because he couldn't bring himself to see his creation go down. But Ismay's fatal error was in making an enemy out of William Randolph Hearst, who controlled much of the media over in the United States, who then created a global smear campaign against Ismay. Now, we're talking some really ridiculous stuff. Famously, there was one newspaper spread that showed names of the dead, the famous and the wealthy like John Jacob Astor and others who had died on Titanic, and then under the name saved, just put Ismay's name. And it worked. To this day, Ismay is remembered as the villain, the one who essentially drove Titanic to her doom. But those quotes actually reveal a guy who probably wasn't really that way inclined. Yeah, he was definitely a businessman, and he was very proud of what he and his company had accomplished. But it seems to me that he always would prefer to defer to the captain's judgment rather than put pressure on them in any way, and even pushed back on his colleague's suggestion to get Olympic into New York earlier. So he seems to me to be a guy who really isn't sitting there kind of twirling his moustache and just trying to save a buck or get his ship in early to try and make headlines necessarily. More so a guy who's just very proud, excited about what's going on. And it's a little bit annoying to see the film that a lot of people look to kind of get their information on Titanic, understand the history of what's going on, to portray him this way as a villain. I don't think he was a villain. I think he was just an excited businessman. Now, another one of these unfair characterizations is First Officer William Murdoch. In the film, he can be seen doing stuff like this.
Women and children only!
Now, again, this is a real person. This is a guy that actually existed. He was a White Star Line veteran. He'd done very well to get himself to this position as first officer on Titanic. And in fact, he was going to be the ship's chief officer. So he knew his stuff. He was no incompetent. But the film kind of makes him out to be either easily distracted when he is watching Rose and Jack instead of keeping an eye out on his duties. He's accused of shooting passengers. At one point, he even kind of seems to take a bribe. And then the film, right at the end, even postulates as to his death. But we don't know that any of this is true, especially not the first few things there. There's no evidence of Murdoch doing anything else that night other than trying to save as many lives as he could. Murdoch was in charge of the boats on the starboard side of the ship, and from the moment that Smith gave the order to put women and children first into the boats, he did it. He followed that order to a T, filled boats with women and children, and then allowed male passengers to join them. Whereas on the other side of the ship, on the port side, Second Officer Charles Lightoller was only allowing women and children all men had to stand back and that the boats were lowered half, and sometimes even less than half, full. Murdoch died with the ship, and he died a hero. He'd spent the entire night getting as many people away as possible. And it's really unfair to see him characterized this way. This, again, was a real guy, and I know for a fact that his family, who still exist, his descendants, are really unhappy with the way that Murdoch was portrayed. Thanks to accounts from passengers like Eugene Daly or George Reams, we get the impression that there probably was gunshots and, passengers potentially being frightened away with guns or even actually being shot at if they were trying to rush the boats. There are even hints of an officer actually shooting themselves and testimony to that effect from a number of passengers, but all of the details are conflicting, and we certainly can't level a finger and say who it was that actually did it. And so I think that by showing Murdoch doing these things and painting him to be a certain way, I think is pretty unfair, because again, films and media are the way that people consume history and learn about it. So I think this is a really unfair characterization. Lastly, and this is a really pervasive one as well, are the final moments of Thomas Andrews, the ship's chief designer. Now, right at the end, there's a quick interaction between Andrews and the main characters. He's seen in the smoking room, the first class smoking room, at the stern of the ship. Now, the first class smoking room was where gentlemen passengers would gather from first class after dinner and play cards and converse, in very much the style of a English gentleman's club. Now, in the film, Andrews is there, kind of in a state of shock, and fair enough too. I would be. I'm sure all of us would be. And he's even seen fixing the clock's time, which is a cute little detail that alludes to his eye for perfection. But it's not really true. It's not really the way it played out. It's inferred in the film that that's the way Andrews died, that he stayed there and was lost with the ship. Now, this is actually based on some testimony from a steward. One of the Veranda Cafe stewards went on to say that he saw Andrews supposedly around about 2 o'clock in the morning, maybe after 2:05. But according to the book, On a Sea of Glass, the truth is actually a little more interesting than that. It turns out that the quote attributed to this steward and the time attributed to that sighting of Andrews is kind of a bit of a guess. Nobody really knows when Andrews was in the first class smoking room. It seems likely that he actually went there at some point, maybe around about 1:40 in the morning, to gather his thoughts. Until that point, he'd been going around giving life belts out, trying to help people into boats and doing his best to prevent a panic while evacuating his ship. It seems that he might have gone to kind of take a break and maybe gather his thoughts, but he didn't stay there. In the film, it shows Andrews right at the stern of the ship, away from the action zone. As the Titanic is sinking and the bow's getting lower, the aft boats have been launched, and all that's left to do now is to lower the collapsible boats right at towards the bow below the first funnel. By putting Andrews right at the end, away from the action zone, it kind of looks like he's checked out and he's accepted his fate and he's staying away from the drama of it all. But there was a sighting of Andrews right at the very end, and he was much closer to the action. Mess steward William Fitzpatrick says that as Titanic took her final plunge and the bow disappeared beneath the ocean, he saw Thomas Andrews and Captain Smith leap into the ocean from near the bridge. Now, this sounds much closer to Andrews' character. He was somebody who was very keen to get people off the ship. He had overseen much of the evacuation from different parts of the ship. He had given, like I said, life belts out. He was very, very keen to make sure that people were safe. And it seems totally out of character for him to kind of check out and go into a daze, because there's no evidence at all that this guy was zoned out at any point in the sinking. He might have taken a moment to go to the smoking room, gather his thoughts, and then move on. But it seems much more likely that he was in the action, in the heart of it, trying to help where he could evacuate the ship. Again, by showing Andrews checked out away from the action zone, it might be a little bit of an unfair mischaracterization of this guy. You might walk away from the film thinking he did his best, but then maybe he gave up. But it's not true. So there you go. You guys know I'm more of a rivet counter kind of guy. I'm not so much into the human stories, character kind of thing as far as the Titanic story goes, but these are some little errors that just irk me a little bit. I think mischaracterization of real historic people in a film that is largely based on history with a big fictional element is a little bit, aside from being insensitive, is a little bit irresponsible, because this is kind of how we take history in. This is kind of how we now understand things to be. Not everybody has the time to read big, dry books about this stuff. It's probably why you guys are watching my YouTube channel right now in the first place. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed this curious look at some errors made in the film Titanic. If you thought it was interesting, let me know in the comments. And if you can think of any other errors or funny things about the film you'd like me to check out, also let me know in the comments. As always, stay safe, stay happy, and I'll see you again next time. Ladies and gentlemen, it's your friend Mike Brady from Oceanliner Designs. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please leave a comment below. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel because we get new videos out weekly. If you want to support my work and get really cool perks like behind the scenes and early access, please visit my Patreon and the link in the description below, or sign up as a YouTube member. Come and join the crew. As always, stay safe, stay happy, and I'll see you again next time.